Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really excited to talk about this subject because you're like kind of my test audience. I have not published this anywhere yet, and I'm still working out some of the kinks, but it is such a fascinating story, and really I think that if I had to a lot of times when you're doing research, you go down a lot of rabbit holes, and then you kind of have to come out for breath and be like, okay, what is this about? And I would say that the question that I'm trying to answer is what happens when a folk tale or a folk motif or a folk art enters broader culture, and what happens to the folk part of that. So the case study today is going to be Bambi, Felix Salten's Bambi. He had, the first time it appeared, it was serialized in 1922 in an Austrian newspaper, not Jewish, but as Paul Reiter pointed out, it conveyed a lot of Jewish Ashkenazi material, so much so that in 1935, the Nazi government banned it. I mean, that's not a big deal, but as a political allegory that they saw behind it, the thesis or the point being that the perpetual persecution of Jews in Europe, i.e. Jews being the deer. And Iris Bruce gave a more empowered version of this political allegory by looking at the great prince's warning to Bambi and to the forest animals, saying you might think that you can assimilate, and you might think that you can go unnoticed, but at the end they'll come and find you, and so therefore you have to go after your own political autonomy. So, this kind of thesis, of course, would tie in with Austrian Zionism at the time. He did write for Zionist periodicals, considered himself a Zionist, and wrote the obituary for Herzl. Jewish audiences identified with the tale as self-reflexive, which I don't think you can tell when the book first came out in 24, but you certainly can tell when it came out in Yiddish translation, published by the Kultur League in Warsaw in 1930. And you can't really tell from this slide, but it's a nice cloth cover. It had embossed gold lettering on it. It was finished with decorative end papers, and it contained some of the most respected intellectuals of the Kultur League movement, including the translator Levi Hod and the writer who wrote the foreword, Shalom Ash. This is actually the foreword by Ash, and while German language critics identified Eastern European Jews as the subject of the allegory, Ash made a point to point out, no, the characterization is not the Ausjuden. In fact, Salten was a modern Jew, he said, and that he helped bring the forest into the children's city homes in Eastern Europe, right? That was his point, that this was a modern tale. And he compares Bambi to Rembrandt's Temple Gates, which he said, just like Rembrandt brought down the Parnasse into the Jiddengasse of Amsterdam, the Jewish street of Amsterdam, so too did Salten bring down modern Jews for his audiences. And so with this kind of stake in the ground, he asks his readers to also look into their own street for material that they can relate to. And the material in Jewish streets in Warsaw and Eastern Europe in general that would be relevant to this was actually not narrative driven. It was visual, and it was one of the most popular motifs still that remained in Eastern Europe at the time, which was the deer. It was painted on synagogues, sculpted into tombstones, and it appeared on ceremonial objects. There's actually two different types of Jewish deer motifs. One represents the Jewish past, the hunted Jew. Mike Markle Epstein writes a lot about this. But basically the hunted Jew being representative of what Salo Baron would call the lachrymose version of Jewish history, hunted and constantly persecuted. This deer has his head turned to the back, and the idea being that he's looking at his hunters as he runs away. And the other one is the deer of the Jewish future, or the messianic deer. It says in the background, Ratz Katzvi, that he should be swift. It's from the Mishnaic verse. Be swift like a gazelle. That instead of it being run off, it's to be swift. And this was often messianic. And in this version, the deer runs forward and he looks straight ahead. So Ash is evoking these contemporary spaces that his readers would have been familiar with, and which Culture League intellectuals were very actively engaged in, but they were engaged in a specific way, which is taking these motifs that have been around as separate for hundreds of years and putting them together for the first time in the 19-teens. So I have a few examples of this. Natan Altman, which is the backwards looking deer, but he is at rest. Or Udovin's backwards looking deer who leaps though into the future. The aggressive kicking deer and still backwards looking. So in short, these Culture League intellectuals were experimenting with the relationship that had been separate by combining them into one imagery. This is one of my favorite ones, which is not the imagery, but here in poem form, published the same time that Bambi came out as a novel, which is this little poem about Elohen Antilopot, that these are the antelope and they live in Africa and they have, all these different characteristic traits. And they're kind of like our domestic deer in Poland in the sense that they too run quickly, but, right, with all the other things they don't have, meaning their ears are bent, their back is bent, right? So this play on run quickly, that they run off the land. So I guess I would suggest, just by this little demonstration, that Sultan didn't really write the original tale that we always assume he wrote, but that he translated what had been around for several years as a very avant-garde modern Jewish trope. And the uniqueness of what he did is that he put it into German letters. So most people, when they, I think, look at the Jewish roots of Bambi, start with Sultan, but really I think that this is almost the end of the process. That's what Sultan did, is he made a Jewish motif and he gave it a beautiful package of German letters. Well, in America, the Jews that were very attracted to to Sultan's Bambi were actually German-speaking Jews in America, beginning with the Austrian emigre Max Schuster of Simon & Schuster, who decided to publish this in English translation, and he too tried to wrap this Jewish allegory into non-Jewish packaging. So, as Sultan himself had done, so this is a parallel to what Sultan was doing. Schuster contracted the young communist intellectual Whittaker Chambers, to translate it. And he contracted the German-born illustrator, Kurt Weiss, to illustrate it. And if you look at his illustrations, they are naturalistically rendered ink drawings. They are very different than the Jewish motifs. They're understated brown tones. And he, too, took lots of care in presenting the deer and the book in general, which also was used decorative end papers, even though the bookbinding process no longer needed end papers, and so it was just a throwback to 19th century books. And then finally, Schuster contracted British novelist John Galsworthy to endorse the book, and he very directly de-ethnicized the allegory by basically writing and endorsing it and recommending it to hunters, that's who should read the book. Yes. So Bambi's first cinematographic foray in America also began with a German Jewish emigre, Sidney Franklin, who bought the rights in 1933 for $1,000. And then he attempted to de-ethnicize the book as well by doing recordings of Margaret Sullivan, she's an actress who had a Southern accent, and also this is the only Canadian piece I have in the entire lecture, a Canadian actor, Victor Jory, who also sounded not Jewish to him, and he played that out, but he saw that he couldn't do what needed to be done in the way he wanted to do it through live action. So he turned to animation. He said, it's impossible to do this deer fable with real deer. So he turned to Disney in 1933. What Disney did, and it took several years, and in fact he ended up dedicating the movie to Sidney Franklin. What Disney did is, with perfection, he cast the tale's themes into a Christian light. Bambi became a universal messiah. His birth was manger-like. And what we could say is that if Bambi had Jewish roots, like Paul Reider said, that what Disney gave him was Protestant offshoots. In terms of setting, what Disney did was that he was able to relocate the action from Salton's Black Forest in Vienna to Maine with the rugged wilderness of North America. And that was very important to the film. Disney wanted Bambi rendered as realistically as possible. In fact, he brought real deer into the training courses for modeling with the animators, and gave Bambi the quintessential childlike features that would encourage emotional identification, such as the big eyes and the childlike voice. Outside of Bambi, all the things with animation, like trick film and gags, that was all in the forest. But Bambi himself was rendered his movements as realistically as possible. And he channeled all the darkness of Salton's forest, which was filled with murder and persecution and, lots of dead things everywhere, into one villain, man, who was an off-screen villain. He's still very scary. People are still traumatized by a man who puts his fires all over the forest and who kills Bambi's mother off-screen, and then you hear the shot. It's traumatizing, yeah? And you'd think this would be a big success because we all know Bambi is a classic. But at the time that it came out in 1942, it was just in August 1942, it was just a few days after Pearl Harbor, and Americans did not want to be re-traumatized, and it was actually a very bad time for Bambi to come out. So it failed in the box offices. But I just want to take a small detour now to the Hebrew language market for Bambi, because it was not translated until 1941 for the first time, which is really quite late. It was translated into 70 different languages. So for Hebrew to be so late in the game in 1941 is telling. And the reason why I think that Bambi wasn't translated as one of the original books to be translated for children is that the Yiddish book market preferred strong animal types, and Bambi was a diaspora Jew. Okay, he'd lost his mother. He walked around crying the whole time, and he remained to live in the forest. It was kind of a disaster. But in 1941, with the war, the yeshuv took a little break from its anti-diaspora position and not only translated Bambi, but did so multiple times. And it was illustrated by Nachum Gutman, who was one of the quintessential yeshuv artists, who illustrated the fable in his quintessential naive style. Inside, which I don't have slides, I'm sorry, I couldn't find it when I was preparing this. The near side of the field where Bambi was the field that would separate life and death. And Gutman painted where Bambi was safe in all the localized Mediterranean fauna and flora, and the far side where the hunters were in elm trees and Eastern European type foliage. Anyway, this short-lived affection for the Bambi story actually resulted in one of the quintessential Zionist images that people don't talk about, because they always talk about the Zionist images that were unique and very Mediterranean-like. But actually, for the post office, the committee that was looking to create symbols asked for a Semel HaTzvi, which was supposed to be, a sign of the gazelle, the Mediterranean gazelle. But everyone who what's it called when you put in your design in the competition? Submitted, thank you. Submitted, instead did a multi-pronged antlers that were like the Eastern European Jews, because they were drawing from the only tradition they knew, which were these Eastern European motifs. And so this is one that didn't win, but I just wanted to show you. Okay, they were all very similar. They were like the motifs that they were used to. They were all jumping against a dark background, multi-pronged horns, and clearly the deer that is the messianic deer, jumping into the future. And that was going to be, very appropriately, the sign for the post office. And actually what I like about these two, there were actually other entries, is that they both do paper cuts as their style. And so it's great for the post office, paper cuts, paper, I don't know. And it appeared in the mail in many different variations, and it was this short-lived, and I would say like the only Zionist symbol from that era, from 1949, that used actually and was willing to use an Eastern European image. Okay, back to Disney. Released in 1942, a few days after Pearl Harbor. Remember this? Okay, so reviewers were like, we're re-traumatized. We want Disney's magic, right? Okay, that was just a review. So the irony is that it failed in the box office in America, but it was saved by the Soviet Union. Okay, this is the part where I get to the Soviet Union. She asked me to do Soviet. Okay, so this was really shocking because this, we think of this big Cold War, but remember this is 1942, and they buy the distribution rights in 1943 when they're allies against the common cause, right? The fascists, and there's something about this that seems like it's an anti-fascist tale, which actually it was, even when it was made. Sidney Franklin clearly wanted to make it this way. And so there's lots of newspaper reports. Lev Kasil, says that lauds Bambi as an example of what the West can produce despite the West's shortcomings. Ivan Ivano, who is... actually, his name's Ivan Ivanovano. Okay, not Jewish, right? Okay, so this name should make it clear. And he was the patriarch of Soviet animation. And he says Bambi is the best of the best that the West has produced. Sergei Eisenstein says that Bambi crowns the whole study of Disney. And actually, in this article, he actually, unfortunately, says there are no ideological differences that separate Soviet and American animation. This will be very bad for him, in a few years when there's the anti-cosmopolitan campaigns, but he thought he was doing a good thing at the time. This leads to, in 1946, for the Russian translation of Bambi. Now, if it was late in 1941 to translate in Hebrew Bambi, why did the Soviet Union wait for the first Russian translation in 1946? Am I allowed to take questions? No? Okay. All right. So the answer is that it was the entire forest was completely antithetical to the communist worldview. It was completely hierarchical. The strong ones eat the weak ones, right? And there's like no way for them to be fought, and there's no revolution. The stupid deer just keep accepting their fate. So this was not, right? This was not something that was going to get translated. But because of this short period, again, after the war, where Disney's Bambi became one of the most popular movies in the Soviet Union, there was like this small window of opportunity to translate into Russian. And Yuri Nagiban, who was the Russian translator, at the time he thought he was Jewish. He wasn't actually Jewish, but he said it was his history of experiencing anti-Semitism that provided him with the ability to translate this correctly. And and if we could just look at this, like one little thing, I know probably not everybody reads Russian, but if we could look at this one little thing, I'll just tell you what it says in terms of the differences. Differences were made, okay? And one was Bambi in the American version, if you could see, and this follows the German version, even though you can, of course, look for the nuance. But pretty much it follows the German version. And the old stag has just brought Bambi to a hunter that's laying dead in the forest. And he says, "You see Bambi? Do you see? He's lying there, dead, just like us. He too can die, right? He isn't all powerful, as they say. Everything that lives and grows doesn't come from him. He isn't above us." And now clearly we're using the language here of God, right? That the deer have to come to accept that man is not God because he too can die. And he suffers the same way as we do, and he can be killed just like us, right? And then there was silence. Now, remember, Sultan is a Viennese Jew. And he has the old stag says, "Do you understand me?" And Bambi says, "I think so," in a whisper. And it's like gotten really spiritual here. And he says, "Then speak." And he says, "There is another who is over us all, over us and over him." And the stag says, "Yes." And now he can go off to die in peace because he's done his job to train Bambi with the ultimate lesson. Okay, that's not going to appear in the Russian communist version of Bambi, right? So the same thing happens. The old stag gives his this isn't touch type. Gives his speech, but it's longer. If you could tell that big paragraph, it's much longer. He adds things like, "We deer are gentle creatures. We deer would never hurt anyone. We would help a friend, anyone in need. However, right, they would hurt us, and the time has come that that we have to understand the law of life." Zakon жизни. "And do you understand me, Bambi?" And Bambi says quietly, "Yes." The law of life. We must struggle. It is a struggle, right? It is a struggle. That's the law of life. Not that there's God above him, the God, but that it is a struggle. And then the old stag says, "Okay, now you understand, and now I can go die in peace." Okay, this to me, I mean, the first time I read this, and I think it's more beautiful in the Russian, or more touching, or more like maybe how my mother would sound. But that it's like this like lesson that like you have to suffer and you have to do what has to be done, because otherwise they'll get you, right? So it really is an anti-fascist allegory, and it becomes popular in the Soviet Union until 1948. See, things go very quickly in the Soviet Union in terms of like what's in and what's out. So 1948, Disney in America becomes the paragon of anti-communism, and he testifies for the House of Un-American Committee, and basically he becomes the quintessential American, and everyone else are these Jewish communists. So that doesn't help the legacy of Bambi in the Soviet Union, and it also didn't help that, I'm going to say his name, Whittaker Chambers also testified at the House of Un-American Committees, and he became actually the poster child of the committee because he had actually served as a spy in the Soviet underground back when it was kind of, cool. And he had renounced all this, and he had served now as a witness for the House of Un-American Committees. So Bambi was out. Okay, the translator was bad, Disney was bad, the whole thing was out. And Life magazine ironically reports that according, they're making fun. They're saying the Soviets think that Bambi is a sinister influence, and they're really kind of laughing at the Soviet Union. But there's actually more truth to this and more credibility to this than it would appear. No part of Bambi was in the original plan, and kind of ideologically did impose a problem. So the Russian critics warned that Walt Disney's Dear Bambi and any animals of similar sinister influence will have to disappear from Moscow movie houses. Another critic said Bambi was squeezing the Soviet substance into an alien form. Well, in 1948, Disney decided to try again with Bambi. He had lost so much money off Bambi, but the war is finally over. The Soviet Union was out because the film relations basically died out, and he looked to the East. And he looked to India, he looked to Japan, and Bambi was the largest foreign distribution release in history to that period. He dubbed it in each country with local actors. So the Hindustani dubbing was with local Hindustani actors, and the Urdu was with local Urdu actors. And the marketing campaign threatened at the time the Soviet efforts in India as well, because the Soviet Union also lost America as a viable market. So they came over, and at first, Bambi won the day. Bambi, different critics wrote that, oh no, this is going to threaten the poor Indian purse. Anyway, he collected, it inspired a group of Indian filmmakers who said, okay, we want to open up our own Indian animation industry. How much time do I have? And it was perfect for the newly independent India, right? India became newly independent in 1947. So animation was going to do for India what it had done, what it could do. And what they did is they invited Claire Weeks, who was an animator of Bambi. And Claire Weeks came, he actually was born in India, and he taught them how to animate based on the model sheets of Bambi. So when they finally made the Banyan deer, it looked a lot like Bambi. And the story was told as a traditional Buddhist tale, but the humanized deer resembled Bambi, and you see them doing it here. And Ram Mohan, who is a Indian animator, said the banyan deer was supposed to be the representation of the Bharavista, and instead ended up being the avatar of Bambi. So the producer of the banyan deer and kind of the beginnings of Indian animation was Ezra Mir, who himself was a Jew, part of the tiny Baghdadi community in India, who had come over from the Baghdadi community to India, and they had their story. But before they were able to actually make the banyan deer, and they were still kind of shopping around for animation, Moscow came in with their deer fable that was supposed to be the other deer fable on the market. They didn't mention Bambi. They were like the other one. And it scrambled to appeal specifically to the Indian market. The team that worked on this were Jewish, Yiddish speakers. They had all lost their families in the Holocaust. And they had actually an Armenian director who kind of oversaw and allowed the whole thing to pass through for them. And their deer was going to be different, and it was going to be setting it straight than the Bambi deer. It too was distributed. It was the largest distribution of any Soviet film at the time, mostly to India. So the critics noticed, and they said, this is the complete antithesis to Disney's Bambi with its overt imperialist sentiments. And the Soviet version consciously diverged from Disney. Bambi, the movie Bambi goes around the life cycle of a deer who grows into maturation to become the great prince. The golden antelope is born completely matured. He has nothing to learn. Bambi has to go through this dynamic character change to avoid his enemies, but the golden antelope not only remains unchanged as a consequence of man, but never really has to fear man. Rather, it is her enemies who must learn the film's moral lesson. And the Raja who's hunting her gets buried in the gold of her hooves. So, kind of like the Midas touch type thing. Bambi has to make peace with the harsh laws of the forest, and the golden antelope doesn't have to adapt to its cruelties because his home lies beyond the hunting ground of the Raja. The script's national setting enabled Abramov, who was the scriptwriter, to insert his personal Jewish perspectives, because Sultan placed his animal fable in Vienna, his local, his nation, Disney in California, Ezra Mir in Bombay, and they all placed the deer hunt in their own national settings. But Abramov set his in India, and by doing that, he was able to do a lot of things in the Soviet Union that he couldn't have done had he placed this fable in, the forests of Russia. So, So Abramov transformed the common native deer into an exotic antelope. And he now comes with this antelope without the multi-pronged antlers, who lives peacefully amongst tigers. And you can see where this is going in terms of that the land of the deer is the messianic land. And it was something that, other members of the Soviet animation studio, Soyuzmultfilm, saw very clearly and complained that this is an inauthentic representation of India. He feels strongly that this is not India, but another recently independent country. And what is this? It's like the 7 animals of the Ark. There was all this talk back and forth. And other council members basically agreed that the antelope had a very strange feeling. An Indian deer shouldn't have a strange feeling. Why does this deer have a strange feeling? Anyway, the entire crew was made up of ethnic minorities. disproportionately Jewish, like Roman Kachanov, Leonard Schwartzman, the composer Vladimir Yurovsky, whose father-in-law actually brought Golda Meir to Moscow, the composer Grigory Gomberg, and the actor Ruvain Simonov. So remember in Disney, there was, we brought real deer in order to kind of copy the real deer movements through rotoscoping. Here, they did the same thing with the Jewish actor Ruben Simonov, and you can really recognize him. I don't know if these few frames show it, but if you watch the movie, you can really recognize this actor in it. And finally, the deer, the antelope, the golden antelope that Schwartzman drew, appeared leaping forward into the future against a pretty standard, a pretty blank background, solid background, kind of like a two-dimensional symbol. The movie starts off with the backwards-looking deer being hunted and ends with the deer jumping to the future, which I would argue was like the Messianic herald, but also communicates the Messianic dreams that we spoke about, but that did the combination of these two deer motifs the way the Eastern European Culture League artists were doing it in the 19-teens and 1920s. And at the end of the film, the boy and the antelope go to a mystical landscape that, is unnamed. And I would argue, or I hope you could see in my demonstration, which is why I have so many slides, because I always want people to see it, that Schwartzman used the deer as the prototype that had come from Eastern Europe, but had gotten Germanized and Americanized and finally, Israelized, Zionized. He was receiving mail from Israel, from the relatives that had gone, and the mail that he received, had this deer on it. And anyone who got mail in the 50s and 60s knows this deer very well, because it was the only stamp that you can put in Israel that can go internationally to Russia. So you couldn't put Israeli stamps. You had to put these Universal Postal stamps, Universal Postal Union series. And this was the stamp for years and years and years. And they would have been familiar through this in so many different, this is what envelopes look like. Okay, it wasn't just a stamp. There was like a stamp, and there was the envelope that had it stamped, and there were like the stamps. Okay, and I see that his design of the golden antelope was not Indian, but Israeli. And he did change his name to Israel after the 1967 war, which is unusual in the Soviet Union at the time. And this is the leaping stag that decorates the Postal Service. But, there are Sultan's European roe deer, Katzenelson's African antelope, the Yeshuv's tzvi, Disney's white-tailed deer, Israel's stag, and Abramov's golden antelope. All of them operate in relationship to the core Jewish motif of deer, the hunted and the free, and the combination of it, which is the kind of the modern amalgamation of these two motifs. And that is my demonstration.